Hey everybody. Good evening. It's Sunday, June 7th, 2020. But what is time? In the middle of a pandemic, it's hard to keep track. Um, it's a good night. I always feel a little weird talking about hope. Um, I mean, God knows a lot of us have been searching for hope, and a lot of us have been hoping for hope. Um, but it feels like something has changed. There's been a shift somehow. Um, it's odd, you know. I I came of age in 2003. I was in college whenever the Bush administration started beating the drums of war against Iraq, and I watched, you know, a lot of people get lost in the fog of war post 9/11. I watched a lot of people get really caught up in propaganda that proved to be um, not just misleading, but dangerous. Killed a lot of people I knew, messed up a lot of people I knew, messed my family up, messed up a lot of people that I loved. Um, I remember marching back in 2003 and 2004 against the Iraq War, and feeling very much when I was younger like the world was against us, and like it was like Sisyphus trying to roll a boulder up a mountain. Um, and that informed a lot of my political identity, and it informed a lot of how I feel about American politics and how it works, and what it can do and what it can't do. And I think since then, um, since 2003 and since the Iraq War and everything that we've seen with Trump, and what we've seen with this current fascistic uprising, I think like a lot of people, I was really afraid to hope again. I feel hope right now, and that's one of the reasons I'm doing this live stream. Is weirdly enough, I feel a measure of hope, and I hope that you do too. I hope that right now, maybe just maybe, as we're watching protests grow in cities around America, and as we're watching Americans start to discover who that they have power. Um, in a lot of my research and a lot of things that I've found, um, I've noticed that American history works in these waves. I've noticed that we go from these moments of feeling like we have no ability to change things, we have no ability to affect political processes, that there are moments where we remember that we have power, and we remember that government gains its sovereignty from the social contract, and that Americans are supposed to grant the government power as long as it serves our interest and as long as it does the business of the people. I assume, like other people who are watching right now, um, have felt for a very long time like our government has been bought and sold. Like this government has not had our best interest in their hearts, um, in that special interest and corporations and the powerful and the wealthy have controlled this government for so long. One of the things that they have meant to do in all of this, and this is something that this is the reason why I feel hope. Uh, People feel as if power resides elsewhere, as if Washington, D.C. is some sort of power play or a soap opera that we watch. I say it all the time that we're watching the most popular television show, which is The Fall of America. It's filled with these characters, it's filled with villains and heroes, and we've been waiting on people to save us. But the crazy truth is that We didn't need heroes to save us. We just needed to remember that we have power, and that we have agency. And I think what we're watching right now in weird spurts and starts is that Americans are starting to realize that they have power and agency. And that the idea of powerlessness and the idea of politics as spectacle is an illusion. We don't have to watch on CNN or MSNBC or, God forbid, Fox News and believe that there are these people, like gods on Mount Olympus who have these passion plays and do these things that have nothing to do with us. And the more that we go in the streets and the more that we take action, um, the more that we remember that politics comes from us and the power comes from us. And I've been screaming about this for a while, uh, because as I studied history and as I was working on my recent book, I started to realize that America goes through these waves, and in these waves, we forget that we have power. The thing I keep coming back around to is like robber barons. At the beginning of the 20th century, these times where power was concentrated in very very small groups, right? And we saw these corporate owners who sort of took over America and bought and sold our government, and we forgot that we had power. But then the progressive movement started to realize that we had power again, and that as long as we were united, and as long as we organized, and as long as we depended on one another, I think that you start to realize more and more with each step that the power resides with people. And I think we're realizing that again. And I think that is incredibly important and crucial. And for people who are watching this, I assume some of you have seen my research and my work, and my writing over the past couple of years. I'm not a person to talk about faulty hope. I'm not a person to push ideas I don't believe in. I don't want to do rah rah politics, and give people false hope. This is the first time in my adult life that I have felt overwhelming hope. There have been moments. Certainly, when Barack Obama was elected in 2008, I felt hope. But this is a moment that isn't about political leaders. It's not about a party nominee. It's not about party structure. It's not about um, party platforms. It's not about something I see in the news. It's originating from the people, and it's originating from the ground up, which is what Americans need to remember, is that power comes from the ground up. And unfortunately, that's been bastardized in the age of Reagan, where everything from the 1980s has been top down. Everything from the economics to the political structure has been all about powerful people deciding for people underneath them how things are supposed to be. But American politics is a pendulum, and it switches back and forth from moments of powerlessness to moments of power. And the good news tonight is I feel like that pendulum's moving, and I hope that you do as well. That doesn't mean this isn't a dangerous moment. It doesn't mean that we're not facing an authoritarian fascist, because I mean that's what Donald Trump is, um, and people like Donald Trump, Tom Cotton, and others like him. Um, we definitely have that. We do. I was writing about this earlier today, and for the past couple of days. Um, Unfortunately, in times of promise and change, that's when the fascists get the most dangerous. It's when they become terrified, and when they see that there's an opportunity for actual change and a change in power and a change in momentum and a change of leverage, that's when they become most dangerous. And I was telling people left and right, Donald Trump is an authoritarian, and that by his inherent nature, he's insecure and he's terrified, and insecure terrified people become authoritarians when they experience power. And he tried, he really did. When he did the Bible stunt, I talked a lot about this. um, I talked a lot about what Trump was doing with the Bible and why he strode out and had this moment of faux power and strength, whatever you want to call it. um, it was a moment that America really could have fallen into the deep waters and drowned. He appealed to everything from the cult of the Shining City, what I call white identity, neo-Confederate evangelicalism. We could have had civil war in the streets, and that doesn't mean that we still can't. When Tom Cotton, of course, got in the New York Times and talked about killing Americans in the streets, that was a moment where we could have realized authoritarianism and straight fascism. There was a backlash against that, and the credit for avoiding that goes to you. It goes to Americans who refuted that and said, we won't stand for it. And we will not put up with, a piece of shit senator from Arkansas saying that people should die in the streets, in order to save power and wealth. Um, these are big victories. I've spent a lot of my career over the past couple of years warning against authoritarianism and fascism. And the truth is that this is one of the moments of hope. This is where fascism and authoritarianism uh, met an equal and opposite reaction: democracy and freedom and liberty. And you all did that. You've all been in the streets. Um, you've suffered heartbreak after heartbreak. You have petitioned. You have signed people up to vote. You've done the hard ass work. And there aren't going to be a lot of victories in our lives simply because we're fighting power and wealth and an elite class that controls almost every aspect of our lives. You have to you have to love the victories. You have to embrace the victories, and you have to understand when you have won a victory. And we have won a victory. It doesn't matter what happens after today. Today is June 7th, 2020. It's a Sunday. God knows what happens tomorrow. God knows what the powerful and the wealthy are going to do in the next couple of days. But as of tonight, like, you've earned your supper. You've earned a really good night's rest. And, in an America where we're endangered and we're facing a constant crisis, you gotta celebrate those victories. And tonight is one of those victories. So I say cheers. I'm gonna look at a couple questions and talk about this stuff. My good friend Jake, and I always appreciate Jake, and I missed Jake during the pandemic and all of that. And Jake asked, "Do I think these demonstrations would be happening if the quarantine hadn't happened?" No, I think there's a lot of things happening here, and unfortunately, mainstream media has a really problematic way of smoothing out a story. Um, right now, they are telling a story that people are pissed off, and they are demanding just simply that the killers of George Floyd be brought to justice. I've said this multiple times. That's just base level stuff. The killers, if you're a murderer, you should be brought to justice. Period. That is as simple as anything. And the idea that the police can get away with murdering a person in daylight, in cold blood, is the problem. Um, that's the first thing. The second thing is that I think Americans, and even Americans that maybe in the past wouldn't have realized this, or maybe in the past wouldn't have recognized this or accepted this. Um, I think Americans are starting to understand systemic racism. I think people are starting to understand power inequality. And one of the reasons that they are is because this pandemic has been um, so fucked up. And I think that sitting at home and watching the government refuse to help us. I mean, I've been pushing this for months now. My God, what is time? I've been talking about this for months, that the Trump administration hasn't failed to fight the pandemic. They didn't even try. It wasn't ever on their radar. Donald Trump is president to destroy government as a means of helping people and as an impediment to corruption and profit. Donald Trump never tried to help us. All he offered was the illusion of helping. He offered the veneer of helping. That's it. And I think there's enough people around America right now who have watched this thing, who have seen people they love either suffer or die. I think it got to the point where all of a sudden it was like, oh, that's right. These people aren't here to help us. They're not only not going to fight a pandemic, they're also not going to offer us economic relief. Our economic system is completely wired against us. I mean, I don't know about you, but as I've been suffering economic anxiety, and as the people I love have been worrying about their jobs and whether or not they can afford food or where they live, um, they've just been told like this is how the economy works. And meanwhile, you turn on the TV and you see the stock market just climbing because nothing about this economy is set up to help us. Nothing about this economy is set up to be human or fair. It's set up to be cruel and to work against our best interest. So I think that all of those things come together. And when I talk to people about this, and people ask what is the problem with America, I always describe it as a knot. It's all these things that interlock with one another, right? White supremacy interlocks with economic inequality. One of the reasons why white supremacy is so useful to the powerful and the wealthy is because it takes white people and tells them, well, you may be poor and you can't afford anything and you can't live a decent life and you can't realize your dreams, but you're better than these people over here. And the most amazing thing about this is if you actually look at the history and you look at all of these documents, white supremacists will tell you this. They will say it in so many words. It was amazing. While I was working on my book, American Rule, I kept finding all these documents from people who gave the game away. And they would say, you know what, like white supremacy and slavery and segregation is all about keeping this financial order, right? And saying, yeah, okay, poor white people, like you're disenchanted with your lives. You can't realize your dreams, you can't get ahead, but guess what? You're above this other group of people. And whenever slavery was being attacked and whenever, segregation was being attacked, like very, very wealthy and powerful white people would say, we have to keep this or else the poor whites will rebel. It was part of a plan. It was a completely organized thing. And now that we've reached a point where people are starting to realize the government isn't there to help them, they're starting to unite. They're starting to come together. And this is one of the reasons why these Black Lives Matter, George Floyd protests are um, so diverse. Is everyone realizes that under this current white supremacist system, we all lose. It actually harms all of us. It keeps us all from power. It keeps us all from earning more. It keeps us from having better lives. So, absolutely, it's a lot of pent up rage. It's a lot of pent up frustration, and it all comes together. Absolutely. All right, leaving. Can you talk about the influence of Fox News as a racist propaganda network? Lee, I absolutely can, but I don't know if we have enough time to go over it. One of the most dangerous inventions in modern human history is Fox News. There's a lot to go over. I had to unfortunately research all of this stuff for the new book. Um, what I kept finding was this. Um, they decided to create Fox News as a marketing niche. They looked at what CNN and MSNBC did, and they said, you know what, we will serve the population that isn't being served, namely white supremacists and white Americans who are afraid of progress and change. And so that was their initial opening. That's how they started, and that was their entire mission. You have Roger Ailes, one of the most disgusting scumbags and sexual assaulting criminals that America has ever seen. Um, they got out in front of this thing and they created an alternate reality where whites were told to be afraid of uprisings by minorities, and of course they always talked about the new world order without ever actually talking about the new world order. That's all they've ever talked about, which of course is an anti-Semitic white supremacist conspiracy theory. It's basically, well, it's not basically, it is, it's the protocols of the elders of Zion with a new paint job, which is how you can also describe the deep state conspiracy theory. But it's all about profiting off of white anxiety. And they've created a complete alternate reality. And eventually, and just to talk about this very, very quickly, because there's a lot to go over and not enough time to do it. Eventually, what happens with propaganda efforts is that propaganda efforts create what you would call true believers, who are people who don't understand its propaganda and think that it's actual reality. This is what happened in 2010 with the Tea Party. You have a group of white Americans who suddenly believe that their alternate reality is real. And then all of a sudden, you have to have a bunch of politicians who start appealing to them, right? So in 2010 and beyond, what you actually find is a group of Republicans. Think about like John Boehner, right? John Boehner doesn't buy into Tea Party rhetoric. He doesn't think Barack Obama is a secret Muslim. He is a Republican. He believes in small government. He believes in lower taxes. He believes in stuff like that. But all of a sudden, they look at the Tea Party and Fox News, and they're like, "Oh shit, we really have to start appealing to these people. We really have to start speaking their language." So all of a sudden, you see people like John Boehner and other Republican mainstays going to Tea Party rallies. At the Tea Party rallies, you start having a new generation of Republicans who have been raised up on this propaganda, who don't know anything else, and they believe what Fox News says, right? And so, what you have now in the Republican Party in 2020 is you have the people who have either completely bought into the propaganda or are best able to recite the propaganda, right? So you either have people who are true believers and they really do think that liberals are trying to destroy America, or they're Republicans who like are able to mimic it, right? There are people who are able to talk the talking points. And so then all of a sudden the Tea Party becomes the norm. And then 10 years later, it gets even worse. And then all of a sudden we're talking about God, deep state, Obama Gate, you know, Mike Flynn being set up by the deep state. All of a sudden, we're talking about Clinton body counts, QAnon. Who knows? It's a bunch of people. It's an Ouroboros that just ends up swallowing itself and going in cycles, and it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse. So, what has actually happened with Fox News? And anybody who hasn't, the best thing that you can do right now, besides studying history, is studying postmodern theory. You start studying the idea that people see images and they see symbols and they start believing in images and symbols and they start creating images and symbols. And like the actual context gets lost. So over time, what you actually end up finding is that these people start believing their bullshit. And they get lost in, again, this Trumpian cycle where all of a sudden they believe in stuff that isn't even just not real. It was never intended to be real, and now all of a sudden they're lost in a hall of mirrors. And unfortunately, that's where we are in America. Okay, um, a question: where do I think this is going? It's a great question. Um, I'll be honest. Among friends, I was a little hesitant to talk about my hope. Once you start talking about the idea of hope, there's a possibility that hope can just go away and break your heart. And do not get me wrong, American politics will break your heart. There are going to be moments in the future that are absolutely going to break your heart and break your spirit. And I'm sorry to tell you that, but it's true. That is the nature of the American experiment. There are going to be moments that are just going to make you feel crushed. But I want to talk about hope. I want to talk about the possibilities here. Um, let's start with the worst possibility. Um, Donald Trump is a coward. Period. Um, Authoritarians are pathetic little pieces of shit. They are the most sad little human beings possible. I spent a lot of time today, reading about um, how fascist regimes get started. And they always get started in moments of masculine crisis, right? They always get started in times where a bunch of young men aren't employed or they don't feel called to a mission. And so what they do is they start hanging out in like paramilitary street gangs and wearing like death head medals and, wearing black uniforms and zig hailing and all this shit. And so what's actually happening at the heart of every fascist movement is a pathetic weakness. And we have unfortunately been told time and time again that fascism is about strength. It's about strong men, right? Authoritarians are strong. And I assume one of the myths that you've been told is Yeah, authoritarians will kill people and they'll hurt people, but they make the trains work run on time and they keep order and they do right things. That's not true. Authoritarians are weak. They're incompetent. They're inherently incompetent. They're not able to form groups. They're not able to do things that work. They fail. And the reason they're authoritarians and dictators is because they can't handle failing, and they have to scapegoat other people, and they have to brutalize people in order to create a regime that looks anything like them succeeding. But they don't succeed. What I'm afraid of, and if I'm being honest, I'll tell you this: what I'm afraid of is that Donald Trump looks incredibly weak right now. I mean, he is hiding out in a bunker like a coward. His numbers are underwater. He's being defeated. He's being pinned in. Every single day, he is just, you know, facing ruin. He, right now, if there's an election in November, he's going to lose. If you want to talk about electoral college, we can talk about it. But right now, the numbers are completely underwater. If he looks at that and the ability that he might lose, and he might face prosecution, and he might face public humiliation, which, by the way, I think he's actually more afraid of public humiliation than he is losing an election. Right? This is a person who has spent his entire life trying to seem like a success. And by the way, real fast, and I say this all the time. Um, After 2012, after Barack Obama beat Mitt Romney by like a drum, and by the way, real fast, props to Mitt Romney, who has shown himself to be a halfway decent human being. And I really wish that we could live in America where we can argue with Mitt Romney about tax policy, right? Because that's what a reasonable Republican should be arguing at this point: is small government and tax policy. After Obama absolutely destroyed Mitt Romney in 2012, Donald Trump started tweeting that Americans should be in the streets, that it should be a new revolution, that elections were fraudulent and not real. He didn't care about Mitt Romney. And if you think that his reaction to Mitt Romney losing would be worse than what his reaction to losing was, I have another story for you. Okay. So we do have the idea of whether or not Donald Trump will have to face a loss in an election, which he'll be desperate about. But he also seems weak right now. These protests, if they continue, they are a loss for him. He has promised to rein them in. He has said they are terrorists. And if he's not able to rein in terrorists, then what's he there for? What is a strongman? So the worst case scenario is that what he did the other day with the Bible and the walk over to the church and all of that bullshit, the real fear is that that is just a practice run. If he becomes more and more afraid of what's actually happening and more afraid of being laughed at and being publicly humiliated by these protests, there's no telling what he'll do. The good news, and I was writing about this today, and one of the reasons why I'm actually hopeful is that the military is sending out all kinds of notices and memos that remind troops to obey the Constitution and that they're there to serve the people. This hasn't gotten talked a lot in the media. Um, it was a huge win. It could have been bad. We could have had military in the street like fascist Trump and fascist Cotton wanted, and we could have had blood in the streets, and we could have been looking at a real existential societal political crisis. The fact that we've avoided that so far is a major win. And again, we have to celebrate the wins. We have to go to sleep at night knowing where we have succeeded and what we've been able to do. Trump could double down, and God knows he could find some people who don't have the scruples that these military leaders do. That's worst case scenario. And unfortunately, our media and Americans are trained to obey this kind of stuff. The next possibility is that this thing fizzles out. Um, these protests in the street rely on a lot of people using their power and their energy to be there. We are many days into this. There is a possibility that people will just stop showing up because they feel as if they've won some victories, they've proven their point. I was really emboldened today by hearing that the Minneapolis City Council was going to disband the police and work towards community policing. That's a huge win. But that's not everything. We can't just rely on symbolic victories. We can't just rely on police getting on their knees and, saying Black Lives Matter. Those things are gestures and they're welcome, thank God. But they're also what I like to call CNN or Time Life gestures, things that you would see in documentaries years from now. They're the beginnings of progress, but actual progress is actually talking about things like white supremacy and economic inequality and talking about where power lies and whether or not power is top down or bottom up. The great news is that we're remembering that we have power and we have sovereignty. We have to be out there. And I know that it's dangerous with the pandemic. God knows I went out and protested the other day and I was worried about it too. This is bigger than that. This is I don't want to sound dramatic, but this is what I'm doing this for, and this is one of the reasons I'm having this conversation. This is one of those moments that 20, 30, 40 years from now, you're going to sit down and you're going to have to reckon with yourself about what you've done and how you stood up to fascism and how you stood up for what's right. It's not just about defunding police or moving finances around. It's about whether or not America can have a future. Because unfortunately, America is endangered by top down power. It's endangered by corporations and the wealthy and the powerful wielding, our democracy against us. It's whether or not our kids or our grandkids or our grandkids' kids can have a better life, and they can. The amazing thing about this is it's a malleable moment of change. Um, I assume that a lot of you have been paying attention to the news and you've been shocked, by the rate of change and the way things happen. But you can't let off the gas. We have to keep showing up. It has to be like a job. It has to be like a movement, because if we don't, the momentum will go away, and we're just going to find ourselves just back where we are. Okay, question about postmodern theory. Um, I assume some of you have watched The Matrix. Um, a funny thing about The Matrix is if you watch at the beginning of The Matrix, Neo opens up like a book safe. The Wachowski sisters put in a little Easter egg for you. They mentioned um, it's called Simulacra by Baudrillard. Simulation Simulacra. Baudrillard had this country dead to rights. He understood exactly what was happening because we have mass culture and popular culture. And so we have a bunch of images that are just shooting across each other and doing a bunch of different things. And what we end up doing is we miss the meaning. Now, Baudrillard is a little bit hard to understand sometimes. I mean, he's a French postmodernist. I mean, you have to, you know, give him leeway. But if you start looking into postmodern theory, what you end up finding is that mass culture and pop culture throw us a lot of different symbols, and so we end up getting a lot of these things mixed up. And to give an example for anyone who wants to understand how this thing works, um, think about the flag, right? And this is actually, weirdly enough, this is something that Trump has started doing. In the middle of all of this, he's like, we have to respect our flag. This thing hasn't had anything to do with the flag, but he's trying to turn it into a flag burning sort of a thing, right? The flag has no meaning. It's a piece of cloth, it's stars and stripes. It is a symbol for what America is supposed to be. And what America is supposed to be is it's supposed to be a place where you can do a thing like burn a flag or disrespect a flag. But the more that we get lost in the idea of a flag, the more we lose sight of what the flag is supposed to mean. And that's why somebody like Trump makes such a spectacle out of hugging a flag or, whatever in the hell he's doing with the flag. He's not a patriot. He doesn't believe in America any more than he believes in the idea of what America can do for him, right? These people are beyond patriotism and beyond duty to country. What they're obsessed with is what a country like America can do for them, which is they can drain our tax money. They can put it towards the military industrial complex, which we'll talk about in a minute. They can put it towards, corporate raiding, corporate welfare, all of that stuff. And what they're actually doing is they're hiding behind faux patriotism in order to trick you into believing that their causes are what's right. And what ends up happening is the flag loses all meaning, right? And we know this. We watched this happen post 9/11. All of a sudden, people are like, freedom isn't free. Or, you watch, who is it? Toby Keith and the Angry American, or, these colors don't run, or whatever that all that is. It's not real. It's complete symbolism. What America is supposed to be about is freedom and liberty and equality. It's never lived up to those promises. And that's one of the things you have to realize is the relationship with America should be about constant improvement. It should be about talking about what the problems are, figuring out how to fix them, and then fixing them, as opposed to saying, oh, so you have a problem with America, well, you don't love America and you're a traitor, which is unfortunately what a lot of us have seen. But right now, and again, this is a reason for hope, we're actually watching that change. We're watching a lot of people out in the streets who are talking about systemic problems in America, and people are starting to get it. I posted a thing like this on Twitter. My God, it's almost three-quarters of Americans understand this thing, and to get three-quarters of Americans on any page is a miracle. So to get three-quarters of Americans talking about systemic racism is a huge victory. And what you need to understand is that we have momentum right now. I mean, these people are willing to concede anything and have any conversation right now. The fact that like people who are like powerful and elite are talking about ideas like defunding the police should tell you everything. They're terrified of what's changing. Trump has already tried the go straight fascist and it's failed. So now it's time to talk about actual systemic reform, and that's what's possible. That's what happens if we keep showing up in the streets. Clay Starr asked, how is it that our current anti-Islam right-wingers can't see the parallels between their neo-Confederate evangelical faith and the fundamentalist brainwashed poor of the Middle East? That's the question of the hour. That's the $64,000 question. For those of you who are here, I assume you've followed what I've written about and what I've talked about. I grew up in what I have come to call white identity, apocalyptic Christianity. I grew up in an evangelical church that it was a cult. And it told me that, I might walk around the corner any day and just suddenly find Satan manifest in front of me. And if I watched the wrong movie, I could be possessed by a demon, or, that if I listened to the wrong music, that I could go to hell. And I assume that some people who are watching right now grew up in similar circumstances. It's a cult. It's programming. And it's all about, drawing in a circle closer together. What I've found in my research, I found this out, and actually, I always had suspicions. I left the church in my early teens. I always felt very, very suspicious. And it also didn't hurt that I thought about being a preacher for a while. I got really into the idea of, like saving people or being up there and leading people to salvation. And there were all these instances of preachers who, I don't know how else to say it. Let's be real. A lot of hypocrisy, a lot of crimes against the church and against the parishioners. I left the church, and I didn't really understand what the church was. It was in my family. It directed a lot of feelings, a lot of the way we looked at the world. I didn't understand it until I started doing the research on my book, and then suddenly it became very clear what was actually happening with the evangelical church. And for those who aren't familiar, you've probably heard me write it or seen me write about this thing, the cult of the Shining City. Which is the name that I've given this, because we can't just say it's about evangelicals. There are plenty of evangelicals who believe that they need to reach out to people and bring people into the faith, but they're not white identity neo-Confederate people. This all started with the Confederacy, which I don't know about everybody watching this. I wasn't really taught about the Confederacy. I just got taught that they were really into slaves and state rights, and that was a thing. And then we had a war, and it was over. The Confederate States of America was a racist, white supremacist dystopia. It was a Christian nation at its very founding, and all of its services were based around gaining God's favor. When they would lose a battle, Confederate citizens would fast and humiliate themselves. They believed that they were God's chosen people and that God was a white supremacist and that white supremacy was God's plan. After the Confederacy lost, that faith continued through preachers in the South, including Jerry Falwell, who in the 1950s and 1960s built up a white identity church. And eventually, when Martin Luther King started using Christianity to try and lead, to civil rights and equality, Jerry Falwell moved white identity Christianity with neo Confederate undertones towards white supremacy. And they started worshiping wealth and power. They started talking about Satan trying to undermine America. And, there were traitors amongst us and, that they were satanic, allies, which sounds very familiar if you grew up in this or, you grew up in the 1980s because it was all over the place. The reason why people can't recognize it is because white supremacy is also American exceptionalism. When we look at the rest of the world, we are different. And then everybody else for the rest of the world does their own thing. And they're weaker than us and they're less powerful than us and they don't understand as much and they're not as intelligent. So when we look at the rest of the world, they have their problems. But America doesn't have its problems. We're perfect. We're God's chosen nation. And anytime that we have problems, it's because of traitors. It's because of evil people. It's because of liberals trying to ruin America, right? So when we talk about Al Qaeda or we talk about ISIS, that is a problem over here, right? That is religious fundamentalism that turns into violence. We don't want to talk about things like Timothy McVeigh. When we talk about Timothy McVeigh, who is part of a white supremacist anti-New World Order movement, a Christian movement, we talk about lone nuts and lone wolves, right? Which is actually part of white supremacy in media. We say all the time, it's like, oh God, these people did this. I can't believe it. Dylan Roof went in here and killed 9 parishioners. Oh God, what a crazy person. Should we do something about guns? Oh, this guy went into a Walmart in El Paso and gunned down a lot of people. Oh my God, white people are mentally ill. The problem isn't just that white people are mentally ill. The problem is that white supremacy makes us paranoid and makes us violent. And so these conspiracy theories are all about maintaining white fragility because white fragility is always under attack and it's always under attack from, of course, the Jews. Right? It's always under attack by minorities who I post about this on Twitter. The minorities aren't smart enough in this mythology to actually do their own thing. They're being manipulated, right, by the Jews and by powerful people and by the media. Okay, and think about how like QAnon is always like, oh, they're sending messages in cartoons and movies and all this stuff. It's all about the ideas of the elders of protocols of Zion. Okay, or protocols of the elders of Zion. It's hard to get all their white supremacist labels in order, and that's just what the New World Order is as well. And that's what all of these people are obsessed with. It's the idea that minorities and poor people are gathering together to tear apart white supremacy. Now, going back to the idea of hope that we've talked about this whole time, that's the reason for hope. White supremacists, particularly wealthy and powerful white supremacists, understand that the only way that white supremacy can be destroyed is if people of color and poor people join together in a movement, right? And actually, and I wrote about this in my book, and I hope you'll all read it. This was how America was founded. James Madison and others came together and they said, we have to keep all the different groups away from each other. We have to keep them constantly fighting against each other because if they ever realize that they have a common purpose, we're done, right? White supremacists in power, particularly wealthy white supremacists in power, cannot withstand an uprising from people of color and poor people. And so we constantly have to create a division, a cudgel between them. And that was from the very beginning of the American experiment, was the idea that these people had to be kept apart. That's one of the reasons why we have the structure of government that we do, why we have like the 3 branches, why the House of Representatives was considered the House of the People and the Senate was considered the elite structure, and why the executive was over here. They said it. And if you actually want to study this stuff, one of the essential books, and I would argue you should buy these 2 books together. Actually, yeah, these 2 books together if you want to start studying it. One is Madison's Notes from the Constitutional Convention. I had never read it until I started researching for my book, American Rule. It's crazy. It's legitimately crazy the conversations these people have. They said in so many words with the windows bolted and the doors locked and the public held at bay. They said we cannot let poor people control this country. We have to put into place these bastions of power for us, the wealthy white slave owning minority. We have to control the government while allowing them the illusion of anything nearing agency. Now, with the notes from the Constitutional Convention, I would recommend a book that includes the Federalist Papers and the Anti Federalist Papers. And when you start looking at those things and you look at what actually happened in the Constitutional Convention and what's in the Federalist Papers, what you find is that Madison and the other people with him, John Jay and of course Hamilton, you actually find that they lie to the American people. They lie about what happened at the Constitutional Convention and they say, oh no, my God, there was no conversation about power. And this is all about coming together and unity and America being about liberty. But what actually happened is the Federalist Papers, which, neocons and never Trump Republicans, which we can talk about them if you want to, these people get all weepy about this stuff. They get very, very excited about the genius of Madison. But Madison's entire thing was about dividing power and keeping minority groups from gathering together and threatening white majority wealthy power. And so what's happening right now is a moment where their worst nightmares are coming together. It's happened in the past with the counterculture of the 1960s and 1970s, and it happened as well at the turn of the 20th century. And this is one of the reasons why the Constitution had to be written, was all of these different minority groups came together and recognized that they had power and they became threats to the power group. And listen, I always had questions about all this. I was always very suspicious of all of this. But the moment that I started reading the Federalist Papers and I started reading the actual notes from the Constitutional Convention, it's amazing. Have a drink here. Fun fact about the Constitutional Convention, and maybe go and impress people with this trivia. They weren't there to write a constitution. The Constitutional Convention is a complete misnomer. Actually, what had happened was the Articles of the Confederation were falling apart, and they were supposed to meet in Philadelphia to make them better. They were to go and revise the Articles of Confederation. Okay, so they go to Philadelphia, and James Madison. This is funny. James Madison's just hanging out in the Constitutional Hall, as it would come to be known. He gets there before everybody else, and he just starts drawing up all these plans. He doesn't have any authority to create these plans whatsoever. And he starts drawing them up. And as people show up to the Constitutional Convention, they're like, what's going on? He's like, oh, this is what we're discussing. And they're like, well, we're not here to discuss that. And he's like, well, too late. It's what we're discussing. So they end up doing a thing in the Federalist Papers. It's actually funny because they hide behind anonymous names. So Madison, who basically committed a coup, goes into the Federalist Papers, which are letters in local papers, and he's like, well, yes, maybe the people who wrote the Constitution committed a coup, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't vote for it. And it was the guy who committed the coup, which is crazy as shit. Like, I don't know about the rest of you. I never got taught that. I never got taught that in school. I never understood the divide between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But that divide is massive, and it's one of the reasons we have the problems that we have now. All right. I see someone asking, do I think that Trump will accept defeat? No. I I'm sorry. I know this is I know this is a chat about hope, but no, I don't think there's even a possibility that Donald Trump accepts defeat. His entire life has been based around I talked about this in some of my writings. He grew up in the school of Norman Vincent Peale, who, if you haven't looked him up, you should look him up. Norman Vincent Peale wrote about the power of positive thinking, which was the idea that you should never, ever have a negative thought. And it led to a situation where Donald Trump can't accept defeat. I mean, it's the reason why he's so delusional, is he has to believe that he is an infallible God. Um, There's no way he would ever accept defeat. I was talking about this on my podcast the other day, the Muckrake podcast. If you haven't listened to it, please do. Um, when he lost the popular vote in 2016, he told everybody that there was voter fraud. But the number of fraudulent votes was the number that he lost the popular vote by, right? So he literally will do that. I mean, if he loses the Electoral College plus the popular vote, he'll tell everybody it was a stolen election. Now, the bigger question, and this actually goes into how I feel about what's going on now. One of the bigger dangers is that Trump supporters will go in the streets with guns and weapons. And they've already done it. We've seen it. They've gone out with chainsaws and hand blades and AR-15s. Whether or not as they see Trump getting beaten as this movement goes along, will they go out and shed blood? Maybe. There's a real possibility that they will. If he loses, I really don't see a place where his supporters will accept it or where his supporters will believe it's been an actual election. So if we do have an election in November, and if he loses that election, um, I don't know what to expect. I've tried to get out of the prognostication business, but I can tell you it's going to be a really dangerous moment, and people should be ready for that. We should, on one hand, organize to get him defeated in the election, but also organize with the idea that there's a real possibility he won't accept defeat, because there is an actual possibility he won't. All right, Claystar says, follow up in Sapiens. Harari says the last of the three major humanist religions is dying. It's happening in real time now. So what's next? Here's the sad truth, and I'm really glad that you asked that, Clay. The problem is that religion is probably going to move more towards individual experience. So as we watch things like neo-Confederate, white identity, evangelical religion start to hopefully lose elections and lose power and lose their base of influence, I think what you're going to watch is a lot of people who start getting lost in what I would call sex. People who are going to start to say, it's like QAnon. I had a conversation with Mark Andre Argentino this week on the Muckrake podcast, where he started going to QAnon religious ceremonies, and these people truly believe that things like Q or Trump or are ordained by religion. So one of the things you might start to see is more sort of boutique, individualized, cultish sex. There might even be the possibility, and I acknowledge this, during things like the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of it is based on Christianity. I went to a rally yesterday where, they took a cross and they started stapling the names of the dead to the cross. And this has certainly been a part of African American, power movements through American history. Um, it is a thing where you might see a split in the Christian religion. You might see more of a liberal movement towards Christianity or secular Christianity. You're going to see a lot of these boutique ideas where people are served by the religion to believe that their worldview is winning, particularly white nationalists and white supremacists who are watching demographic loss. I mean, they're going to lose elections. Republicans can't win elections if they're free and fair. They're outnumbered. They don't have the numbers anymore. And the only thing they can do is gerrymander and disenfranchise and intimidate. So a lot of them are probably going to move towards what you would call persecution religions, which Christianity lends itself to really, really well. The idea that they are under attack and they are endangered and there's the possibility of an apocalypse or an end time situation. You might see a lot of them moving into what you would call intentional communities. Other people would say that it is a matter of moving together and trying to keep together a race or a group or something like that. You're going to see, I think, a lot of race-based religion, unfortunately, in the near future. If I had to design a social order, what would it look like? That's a great question. I actually, it's funny you brought that up, and I hope you can hear me out for a second. When I went to college, I went to Indiana State in Terre Haute, Indiana. The first sociology class that I went to, the initial question, it was a getting to know you group exercise. And the professor asked us to get into groups and design a society from the ground up. And I will never forget that one of the people in my group said before, when we got together, they were like, oh, this has to be a white Christian society. And everybody in the group, and even I, who is coming from like a white identity community and white identity evangelicalism, we all blanched at it. We were very offended by it. We're like, I don't think this is what we're doing with this assignment. And that has always stuck with me because there's a lot of people who think that in order to have a society, you have to build it on Western ideals, Western civilization, ideas of power. I think that's bullshit. I think one of the most dangerous ideas that we have is perpetual growth. When you actually think about how America works, businesses don't work. I grew up in the 1980s. I don't know about the rest of you. I was pretty poor. I got to go maybe once a year to like a J.C. Penney, and I got to pick out a shirt or a pair of jeans, maybe a pair of Levi's. And that was like big time in the city, right? J.C. Penney is like the kind of institution that if America worked, like it wouldn't actually go away, right? And you read these articles, and I assume that you have too, where it's like McDonald's is in trouble, right? And McDonald's serves billions of people all the time. They're everywhere in the world, and people are like, well, they've had a couple of periods where they haven't had growth and they haven't had profit. That doesn't work. It is actually a system that doesn't like work towards sustainability. I would love an America or a world in which we look at like older cultures, like Native American culture or South American cultures, that are more about human existence. It's more about how we treat each other and we take care of each other and we have sustainable civilization instead of like, oh, we have to continually grow and build and do this and the money always has to go here or there. I would love to get money out of military and law enforcement and start moving towards healthcare and human projects and infrastructure and education. I'd love to get to a point where we start to realize that we're all in this together and we're all working towards common goals or the betterment of human life, which is unfortunately one of the aspirations of American society that's just never lived up to. Leaving asked, how would you frame defund the police as an issue to be discussed and not scary talking point? That's a great question. And I have been wrestling with this for a couple of days. Um, I think it starts by saying this: we don't have money to do things, period. We don't, because we have to keep building up the military and we have to keep building up law enforcement. Um, I think that we have to talk about the fact that if we did not spend so much on law enforcement and we spent more on human development and we spent more on human projects, all of our lives would get better. And I actually think this is one of the reasons why the movement is working right now. I think this is one of the reasons to have hope. And that is this: everyone recognizes that this system is anti human and it's miserable. We're all exhausted. We all feel as if the government doesn't actually take care of us and the government doesn't serve our interests or it doesn't actually represent who we are and how we feel and what we want. If we stopped being afraid and we stopped spending money on tanks for police and my god, armament and militarized weaponry, if we stopped doing that, your kids could have a better education. They could have more teachers. They could have after school programs. And this is the part of it. And I want to talk about like Venn diagrams. I want to talk about where different parts of American society start overlapping with each other. Like, you can talk to someone who considers themselves fiscally conservative or socially conservative and say that their child could be better served by public education if we took money away from the police and the police weren't going to go out in the streets and point a gun at their kid's head. That is an understandable appeal. And unfortunately, and listen, I maybe I'll lose a couple of people here, but I don't care. The Democratic Party has not done a good job of making that argument. They just haven't. They have, unfortunately, and this is one of the reasons we have the modern police state, is that they know that they can win elections when they are tough on crime and they talk about law enforcement and when they posture like Republicans posture. If we start talking about kids having better lives and having better opportunities and having more economic opportunities and their horizons being grown, all of a sudden you take the tear gas out of the dude's hands, and that's one of the great parts about all of this. The police act the way they do because they're an army. They have the armament of an army. And when you take away all of those things, they become members of the community. And all of a sudden, and this is one of the things, and I hope people will follow me with this. If you take away all of the armaments and you take away all of the military vehicles and armor and all of it, the fascists don't want to do it anymore. Like right now, they do a they do this dance, right? They get armored up and they go out and they crack skulls, and it's a bunch of fascists who are, you know, they are just going out and spilling blood, and it's all because they're all pathetic cowards and they can't do anything else, and they have to find a way to vent their rage, and that's to put on a Punisher skull and go out and crack people's skulls, and it's all about fascistic imagination and fascistic fantasies. You take away all that stuff and they're out in the streets and suddenly they have to navigate through people. I think that's huge. And I think when you start telling people that their kids can have a better future if we defund the police, I think that argument wins. First practical step toward a lot of this stuff is universal basic income, agree or disagree. I think the first step is understanding that you can have a support net or a social safety net and that people are still going to go to work. I don't know about the rest of you, but like if I got a universal basic income or if I got something um, approaching like a salary, I wouldn't stop working. I'm ambitious. I want to do stuff. And when I die, I want to leave something behind. And actually, a lot of people in my generation and the generation behind me, that's how they feel. That's why they jump from one job to another, is because they're more interested in what they leave behind. I actually think we've been ingrained with the idea of achieving and striving. I don't think a universal basic income or a social safety net actually makes us lazy. And I actually think everyone who says that, they're lazy. I think that they look at themselves and realize if they had a social safety net, maybe they wouldn't do what they do because they're more interested in money and power. But that's bullshit. I think everybody I know would do what they do because they love it. And if everybody started doing what they do because they loved it, then you would have a situation where all of a sudden everything got better. And it's disgusting that we keep making this argument that like helping people out and creating a social safety net would somehow or another destroy society. I think it's a total lie. Which country has the best system of government in the world in your view? None of them. I think it's a bunch of different things that need to be brought together. I think America in philosophy is right, but in practice is completely wrong. And I think that's actually one of the major problems is the divide between what we say that we believe and what we actually believe. We say we're about freedom and equality, but we're actually about inequality and a lack of freedom. America has had a fascist streak since it was founded. I mean, unfortunately, and I hate to tell you this, but America was founded on inequality and fascism. It just was. Um, if we got our shit together, it could be good. It really could. We have the groundworks to have a great country. We have, the idea of American exceptionalism is really gross, and it has created everything from the genocide of the Native Americans to Nazi Germany, unfortunately. Which, if you want to hear me talk about that, I'm willing to talk about that at length. But American society has real potential, and it always has. All these other places that have everything from universal health care to systems of social safety nets. I think that if we brought all these things together, we could have something really amazing. And I get a lot of flack from people who tell me that I hate America. I don't hate America. I love America. I love America, and I can be honest about what's wrong with this country. And I think if you actually love a country, you can reckon with what it actually is. The Trumpists do not want to help people. No, no, they do not. No, the Trumpists want to have a corporate world in which the wealthy and the powerful have everything to their advantage. I'm going to do a lecture on this in the next couple of weeks, but I want to talk about a thing called post politics. People like Trump and people like big and organizations like big tech and corporations, they're not interested in helping a single person outside of themselves. Post Cold War, all they're interested in doing is taking a thing like America and using it as a means of corruption and profit. They want to get past democracy. That's why they call it managed democracy or illiberal democracy. If you want to know what this country can look like, look at China or look at Russia, and possibly a combination of the two. In China, you have a technocracy that dominates everybody via technology, which is what big tech wants to do, unfortunately. Which, by the way, if you're going to a protest, turn off your GPS data, turn all that stuff off. You don't want them gathering data. You want to be a face in the crowd. That's all. And you look at Russia, where actually Putin and his technologists have created a situation where, they have movements and they have crises, but they're all organized. And actually, somebody just said in the conversation, Randy Savage, it's all professional wrestling in an illiberal democracy. They create rivals like Vladimir Putin, who will parade around without his shirt on, will take on rivals and he'll beat them in elections. But the elections aren't real. They're not about actual democracy. So what we could end up in if we're not careful and if we don't continue this movement, we don't continue fighting, is we could end up in a situation where we have fabricated movements, we have fabricated political parties, fabricated elections, and it all seems real, but we all know it's fake. And I know that you all know that. I know you all know how that feels. Under the Trump regime, you have noticed that there are moments that don't feel real and you feel like you're crazy, but it's still happening, right? And it's beyond your control and it's beyond your power. And so as a result, it feels like you're powerless. But, and just to put a nice bow on this thing before we sign off for the night, you're not powerless. What we're seeing right now is when you get in the streets and when you organize and when you find a common purpose with your fellow American, you win. I mean, right now, you have in Minneapolis, one of America's major cities, they're disbanding their police force and looking towards a community policing. You win every time. If you go out there and you put in the time and you risk everything, you win. When we stay at home, and by the way, you all probably know me from Twitter. Twitter is like a pinball machine. We can talk all day about our outrage. We can talk about what's upsetting us. We can talk about how Trump is lying. We can share memes. We can do things all day. But it's a machine that takes our outrage and it takes our anger and it commodifies it. We have to get in the streets. And I know that it's dangerous, particularly right now during a pandemic. And again, I want you to hear this. Trump and people like him are endangered right now. They are desperate. And God knows that they can be violent when they're endangered and they're desperate. The more you get out in the streets and the more that you actually use your rights and the more that you actually join with your fellow Americans, you win. And the feeling that you're feeling right now is intoxicating and it's inspiring. And I feel it and I know that you feel it as well. If you get out and you do this and you keep fighting and you keep your foot on the gas, you'll win. Because these people, the only way that they win is when we feel like we're powerless, and that's when we don't go out and that's when we don't participate and that's when we don't fight. And when we don't fight is when they win. They only win when we don't fight because there's way more of us than there are of them. So keep after it, okay? And the whole point of this was there's hope. And those of you who have followed my writings and my research, you know that I don't throw that around lightly. This is a legitimate moment of hope. And you have the momentum right now. You have the advantage. If this continues and if it goes along its path, there is no telling what can happen in this country. Because if you look at the powerful, they're talking about things that a couple of weeks ago would have seemed insane. They are willing to accept nearly anything in order to maintain power and control and their own wealth. Things are changing. The momentum has shifted. I'm very grateful for the work that you're doing and for hanging out tonight. And I just hope you're staying safe. There'll be a Muck Rig podcast tomorrow night. I'll tweet about some power stuff tomorrow. Um, thank you. Much affection. And I appreciate all of you. Please be safe. Keep fighting.